welcome to another episode of the Cats HQ podcast. I'm John Hale, the CJ's UK football beat writer, sitting alongside Fletcher Page, CJ's basketball writer. Last week, we, of course, went real deep into the UK baseball turnaround. We're recording this Tuesday afternoon now that a day after we've heard the baseball's tournament fate. Hosting a regional this weekend with Indiana, NC State, and Ohio, also in Lexington. They will not be hosting a super regional unless some upsets play out. They did not get one of the top 8 national seeds. So instead, if they were to win this weekend, they'd head to Louisville, most likely, for a super regional next week. We'll get way more into the baseball tournament bracket maybe toward the end of the episode. But for the most part today, we're going to focus on the news of the week from basketball, which, of course, was a long night for Fletcher on Wednesday as the NBA draft deadline played out, waiting for Hamidou Diallo to decide whether to stay or go. He, of course, did stay, which I'm sure you know by now. And we're going to get deep into what that means for Kentucky, what the lineups are probably going to look like next year. But just to start off, Fletcher, what was that like for you covering that night, and then your maybe immediate reactions to the news for Hami?
Yeah, I woke up that morning about 7 a.m. just to make sure there wasn't an email or anything like that early. But I can confirm that Kentucky's basketball staff didn't know. I know they did not know the day before, and they were 50-50. They believed it was 50-50 going into that last day, and they were sort of looking at Twitter and kind of looking at the internet and waiting maybe for a text message from Diallo too. So just like everybody else, I had talked to Diallo's coach, his prep school coach, a couple times in the weeks leading up to it. He went really quiet on me that last day, and so I was sort of didn't really have an in Queens, so I was just sort of waiting as well. And I contend, and I can't confirm this, but I contend that the longer that went, the better it was for Kentucky. I think if he would have gotten a first-round guarantee from a team after a workout, or maybe just a team that had looked at him and scouted him, if they would have given him that first-round guarantee on Monday or Tuesday or early in the day Wednesday, he would have gone ahead and committed to the draft. But as that thing got into after 5 p.m., I was thinking that he's going to stay at Kentucky, because clearly the only reason why they were waiting was just to wait till the last minute, maybe get that first-round guarantee, and it never came. And so while there were many teams, I think, that were very interested in him, he didn't get exactly the backing he needed, and he ended up coming back to Kentucky.
Yeah, you've said many times throughout this process that you've just been impressed by the kind of the decision-making process for Hamidou throughout this, since he went to prep school, left early, came to Kentucky, and just how kind of logical and well thought out all these moves were for him in terms of making the best decision for him in his career. And the way it played out, I think that only hammers that in more. I mean, now he's been through the process with the NBA scouts. He worked out with them individually. We know he did not play in the 5-on-5 at the Combine, so we still haven't seen him in a team setting. But to be able to go in front of those evaluators and to hear what he needs to improve on, and for them to say, apparently, that there was just too much mystery for them to commit to taking him in the first round. Now he knows he has to come back to Kentucky, and he probably needs to improve his shot. He needs to show those things in real game atmospheres that maybe he showed out in workouts or in testing and drills and whatnot. And I think if he has a big year for Kentucky, very well next year, this could be a lottery pick kind of situation for him for sure.
Right. Yeah. And I don't. Hindsight's 20/20, or I can say that at the time I was a little skeptical too, even at the NBA Combine. When he had the 45 and a half inch max vertical, and everybody said, well, he's gone. And I was thinking, well, we already knew he could jump high. The question mark is his shooting, and obviously his feel for the game, since we haven't seen him play in college. So those questions couldn't be answered with anything he did at the Combine. And so the NBA personal workouts, I think, were probably the biggest aspect of scouting him for the teams. They could actually see him with a ball in his hands, actually have him go through shooting drills and things like that. But I think, like you said, the biggest thing now, moving forward, the biggest thing is kind of like with Isaiah Briscoe last year. This time, he got to hear some feedback, got the feedback. This improves him as a player. This improves his standing for next year's draft. But as it relates to Kentucky fans, this improves what he's going to bring to Kentucky.
And I know that you've talked to Evan Daniels and some other scouting, recruiting people throughout the process about whether Kentucky had a one-and-done player in this class. Kevin Knox appears to be that now, that since they got him. And I think we both would assume that Diallo probably is going to leave next year. He obviously wanted to leave at this point, wanted to see the evaluation, and didn't get the guarantee. So assuming both those guys are gone, That's where we start when we look at this roster for next year in terms of penciling in a starting lineup. I think both of us would agree that Diallo and Knox are the guarantees. You wrote a little bit about this after Diallo declared and then came back. Where do you see those other three spots playing out with right now?
Yeah, I really like the perimeter with Quade Green, Diallo, and Knox. And then I've kind of changed my opinion a little bit recently. I've had Winning Gabriel at the 4, and now I've put PJ Washington there, and then I've got Sasha Kalea-Jones at the 5. I think Nick Richards, from everybody that I've talked to, Evan Daniels included, I think Nick Richards he's an intriguing option, and he could very well play himself into being a first-round pick next year. But I think he's got a ways to go. He was kind of a late starter. He hasn't played a lot of basketball. So he's probably more raw, and I think people are sleeping on Sasha Kalea-Jones, and rightfully so. I mean, he only played in 15 games, I believe, as a freshman. But I think that there's less competition at the 5 than there is at the 4, so that's why I think it's a safer bet to go with SKJ as a starter right now. What's intriguing to me, though, and I don't know where this came from, I started seeing questions of, will Kentucky platoon again?
No.
And I don't see that happening.
No, I don't see any way that happens for him.
Yeah, because I think Quade Green is probably such a clear-cut number 1, the point guard. But, I think Gilgeous-Alexander will be good to mix in. I think he can play the 1 and the 2, maybe the 3 if he had to, depending on what kind of lineups they have out there. So when people ask me that question, I've gotten it on 2 radio shows now. When people ask me about the platoon, I say, instead of a platoon, let's think of it this way. You could go really big, maybe move Diallo to the 2 and well, he already is, I guess. But you could have Knox at the 3, and there's a lot of things you could do at the 4 and the 5. Jared Vanderbilt mixes in there. Nick Richards at almost 7 feet tall. Or you could go really small. Or you could have 2 point guards out there with Gilgeous-Alexander, Quade Green, maybe get a shooter and Jamal Baker. And Winning Gabriel maybe mixes in. So I wouldn't look at it as a platoon, but I see so many different potential lineup combinations, and I'm going to use this term a lot. We're going to find out how creative John Calipari is.
Yeah, I'd come up with a couple reasons that I don't see John Calipari ever platooning again unless something really drastic happens. One, the team he platooned on was a really special case in terms of they had all those, top 5-star McDonald's All-Americans coming in as freshmen, Karl Anthony Towns, Trey Lyles, those guys. So that was part of it, but the bigger part of it was they had all those guys who had come back for their second and third year. So they had the Harrison twins back for another year. Willie Cauley-Stein had come back for his junior year. Dakari Johnson. So they had veterans who I think Cal felt obligated to make sure that they still had their chance to prove for NBA scouts. And then he had Karl Anthony Towns and Devin Booker and Tyler Ulis and Trey Lyles who needed to get their playing minutes too. And obviously by the end of the year, you can make an argument that Ulis and Booker may have been their best backcourt for that Connecticut game, which I think Kentucky fans still have a problem with him not going with those guys down the stretch. But besides that, I just don't see that happening. And this team coming up is, yes, very talented, very deep. But as we mentioned earlier, there are only a couple of these guys who are one-and-done kind of players, at least projected going into it. And then we've seen John Calipari, especially last year, it does not mean if you're a 5-star recruit, if he thinks you have work to do, that you're going to come in and play 20 minutes a game. I mean, Sasha Kalea-Jones is the example of that. He was a McDonald's All-American 5-star recruit last year. And if Calipari was really concerned about this minutes and platooning situation, he could have easily done it a year ago with him and Winning Gabriel and Isaac Humphries and Derek Willis and getting those guys more minutes. And I just don't see that kind of balance here. I think much more likely, maybe he goes really deep and plays 8 or 9 guys for a while, but I think the more likely scenario is he does that early, and then by March, guys like Jamal Baker and whoever gets misses out in the post-battle, those guys kind of fade back like we saw with some of these other guys in the tournament this year.
Yeah, I think too the problem with the platoon idea is there's so many ambiguous players with ambiguous positions. Like it would make sense if you had 2 point guards and 2 shooting guards and 2 threes. But I feel like Diallo could play the 2 or the 3, Knox could play the 3 or the 4, Vanderbilt could play the 3 or the 4, Washington the 3 or the 4, Kalea-Jones all over the place. They don't necessarily. It's kind of like in maybe you used to hear like high school or college football coaches talking about just trying to get their best 5 offensive linemen, not necessarily having to be slotted in as a left tackle or a guard or a center, just figuring out who are the best 5 and putting them out there together. So I don't necessarily think a platoon makes sense just because depending on who you're playing with and alongside, it might change what each player's position is.
I'm going to defer to you for the most part in terms of projected lineups because you have seen these guys coming in way more than I have seen. I have not seen P.J. Washington play really at all. My one question with your projection and a lot of the other ones I've seen since Diallo came back is I think it's just for me, if I'm John Calipari and assuming this guy makes the strides you would expect from his freshman to sophomore years, I think I'd try and find a way to get Wenyen Gabriel in the starting lineup because he's the only player on this roster that has any real experience to speak of. I mean, we know that he was pretty terrible for the last 2 or 3 weeks of the season. By the tournament, had basically been phased out to a 5-6 minute a game guy, but he's played so much more than anyone else on this roster. They're going to need some sort of experience, some sort of veteran presence, and Wenyen Gabriel's the closest they have to that. Assuming he gets stronger and makes some strides, his shot improves a little bit, he's a little more physical inside. I think I almost have to find a way to get him in the starting lineup if I'm the coach of this team.
Yeah, I agree with you in that. Again, if Nick Richards is further along than maybe I'm thinking he is when he gets to campus, that could influence it. I think P.J. Washington he's a little bit more of seems like a bruiser or a powerful type four than Kentucky's had. I know playing with Derek Willis and Wenyen Gabriel last year drove the coaching staff crazy. They just didn't have the defensive presence that they needed. So again, I think that could be right. I think Wenyen or Sasha, one of those two is got to be in the starting lineup, I think, or will early. And then, of course, I think Wenyen, it's hard to figure him out because I think he's got so far to go until he reaches his ceiling. So we'll just see what he's done in terms of putting on weight and improving his game here these past few months.
So we've got 7 guys listed for Kentucky coming in next year: Kevin Knox, Jamal Baker, Jared Vanderbilt, Quaddy Green, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Nick Richards, P.J. Washington. 3 scholarship players coming back: Ty Wynyard, Wenyen Gabriel, Sasha Kalea-Jones. Then with the walk-ons, Brad Calipari leading that group, obviously. Who do you think maybe gets left behind a little bit here? If we both assume they're not going to platoon, who are the guys who are really going to have to fight this summer and fall to make sure that they're in the rotation early on? I think Ty Wynyard obviously probably starts there, even though he played a role last season, and his style of play could give him a situation here or there. But after that, it's a real question mark. I mean, Jamal Baker, I think, is an obvious candidate there, but he shoots so much better than most of these guys. They may need him at some point. I think it'll be really interesting to see how they use some of these other guys.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Knox committing really changed the way that this whole, because I was assuming Mohamed Bamba was going to come, not Knox. And that really changed sort of the way the perimeter was going to shake out. Because then you're thinking, okay, maybe you do play 2-point guards with Gilgeous-Alexander, or maybe you do find a way to get Jamal Baker on the court as a shooter. But with Knox in there, it locks in that 2 and the 3 with Diallo. So I think Baker might be, I'm not going to say like a Michael Mulder type. It might be a little bit different. But there could be situations where they get him on the floor. I have to see where he's at. Honestly, since he's from California, I don't have much information about him. And then Wynyard, of course. So those are probably the 2 guys that are in an uphill battle. But other than that, I think the saving grace for a lot of these players in this situation is just how much versatility they all have. Gilgeous-Alexander, I think, is a guy that might get lost in the shuffle right now in the discussion. But him being able to play point guard and the 2 and being 6'6", so maybe he could play as Isaiah Briscoe as a 3 last year. Defensively, I think that he's going to be able to hang around. So maybe that he's like a utility player in baseball or something. Just giving yourself enough options, providing options to get on the floor. I see the same with Jared Vanderbilt being able to play the 3 and the 4. He's kind of a guy that is now taking a back seat to Kevin Knox, even though he was a guy that was really shooting up the rankings late in the class, and maybe the injuries played a role in that.
And that's the real question still, what his health status is. We assume he'll be ready to play. There's no reason to think he won't be ready to play, but he's had injuries in the past, and maybe that's something you have to take into account in how they deal with him this summer. How many of these guys do you think Cal's going to get a chance to work with maybe a little bit early in terms of Team USA? At least in the training camp in Colorado. I mean, I think that would help a lot of these guys in terms of making an early impact before they get to Kentucky.
That's a good question, and I think most of these players have experience not on the U19 team, I believe on the U18 team, which worked out for Shaka Smart with Mo Bamba in the long run. I think you could see, Knox looks like a guy that Diallo. I think you could see Calipari potentially coaching 4 or 5 of his current players for the next season. But obviously he's already got an invite out to 2018 5-star point guard Emmanuel Quickly. Romeo Langford, his father indicated to me that they were contemplating trying out. It's interesting though, and I've kind of asked around about this. The World Championships this summer in July are in Egypt, and there is a little hesitation. I've been told off the record by a couple people that there's some hesitation if they were to make that team about going overseas at this point in your career. If you're about to start your freshman season at Kentucky, if you've already won a gold medal in U18, there might not be as much at stake or on the line that you're willing to risk going overseas right now. So I think that you could see a lot of players go to the tryout and then maybe have a mysterious ankle injury on the last day or two. I think that's something that you should look for.
Yeah, do you think that event is more important for Calipari in terms of getting an early start with this team or getting an early start with the 2018 recruiting cycle?
Oh, well, I think I'm going to answer this and make Kentucky fans mad. I think it's more important for recruiting always. The team stuff will happen. They'll have time to catch up on that in October, but I think this will be more geared toward a trial run for a 2018 player to see what's it going to be like if I'm a point guard and John Calipari is telling me what to do.
Okay, so we've run through the starting lineups. Both of us were projected. Just to recap there, both have Quade Green, Hamidou Diallo, Kevin Knox, and Sasha Kalea-Jones, and our 4. Fletcher goes with P.J. Washington, and I went with Wenyen Gabriel.
I like that. So you got Wenyen and Sasha together.
Yes.
That's a lot of length.
Yeah, and I mean, and they've got a lot of different ways to go. I mean, that's not even with Nick Richards or Gillis Alexander, however you say his name. He's a long kind of point guard. So Jared Vanderbilt. I mean, obviously there's so many different combinations the way you can go big and small and long. Whatnot. I just kind of lean towards maybe a little bit more experience there.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if Nick Richards beat out Kalea-Jones to start in that lineup, but we'll have plenty of time to figure it out between now and October. With that group, however they line up together, who do you see among this 13-man roster now leading them in scoring this season if you had to pick today?
If I had to pick today, I think I go with Kevin Knox. I think he is so polished, has an outside-inside threat in terms of being able to shoot threes and then be 6'9", and he's already kind of got an NBA look as a small forward. I can't. You would know more than me. Obviously, this is just going to be my second season covering Kentucky. I'm trying to think of a 3 that I could compare him to, which I hate making comparisons, but I don't really. Maybe James Young, but
that's the guy I was trying to think of the last time they've had a guy who was a 3 who really led them in scoring, and it was James Young. But I mean, he's probably more of a 2 at the next level anyway too, and obviously has not had a ton of NBA success to speak of since he left Kentucky. So yeah, it's. I mean, because most of their best 3 to date would be Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, but he was not really a scorer per se. He was a shutdown defender who could dunk and penetrate, but had an awful shot. As I just read this week that he's now working with a new shooting guru to kind of reinvent that in his professional life. So I don't know if Kentucky has ever had a guy like Kevin Knox under John Calipari, and I'm sure we may be forgetting somebody that a fan will reach out and tell us about. But I mean, Trey Lyles played the 3 some. Obviously, Derek Willis played the 3 a little bit at Kentucky. Could shoot. It would be interesting to see if he's their leading scorer, other than Young, who I think is a different kind of player. I don't know that they've had that kind of guy at Kentucky under Calipari Sr.
Oh, I could see like Diallo leading them in scoring early in terms of if they have another start like they did last year and being able to get in up-tempo situations and in transition. I mean, Diallo is such a finisher. And if the court's spread out and he can get space, get in the lane, and get to the rim, I don't see anybody being able to stop him. But I'm sure teams will gear up and figure out a way to get Kentucky into half court. I think it makes sense to pick Knox just because he's a guy that makes scoring look so easy, and you can't take that for granted.
Yeah, and they're going to need somebody to hit knockdown shots, and if Baker is a guy who's on the bench quite a bit, Knox is probably your most likely scenario. Quite Green maybe a little bit, and Alexander too. I think I'll go with Diallo in leading scoring right now, just because I think he's kind of in the absence of a real veteran. Obviously, we talked about Wenyen Gabriel and Sasha Kalea-Jones. I think he's going to be somebody who takes on a lot of the onus just because he has that semester under his belt, although I think maybe that's been blown up a little bit in the narrative of Hamidou Diallo, especially since he came back last week. I would expect Green to be more of a pass-first guy, get these other dudes involved with so many players. And then in the post, as we've seen, there are games where Wenyen Gabriel can go out and get 16 rebounds. There are games where he can go out and score some points and hit 3 or 4 threes. But I don't know that that's going to happen consistently enough for him to be a leading scorer. Same with Kalea Jones or Nick Richards or the other guys, Washington, Vanderbilt, who may play in some of those positions off the bench. So I think it's between Diallo and Knox for me. I could see it going either way, but I do like the fact that Knox is going to be able to hit some shots on the perimeter, because otherwise I don't know who really is going to do that for this offense.
Yeah, Quade Green's interesting to me too, but again, seeing maybe the adjustment that it takes a special, I think, kind of point guard to be able to score and shoot at the college level and then the NBA level. I think we saw that with De'Aaron Fox last year, where Malik Monk was getting all those catch and shoot opportunities, and being able to create for yourself and shoot off the dribble is very difficult. So I just have to see how it plays out and how the offense sort of runs.
I mean, you've written about this before in terms of his leadership and his kind of, bulldog mentality at the
Quade.
Yeah. How important is that going to be for this team, especially considering there's not a real obvious veteran to bring that like Briscoe or whoever in recent years?
I hope this makes sense. So I was talking to him at McDonald's All-American game. I was kind of thinking, like, this kid, I was thinking, he doesn't know what he doesn't know, obviously. Yeah. And, man, he is so confident. But it didn't come off as arrogant or cocky. It was just very sure of where he's going and how he's going to get it done. And, yeah, with a team like this, I think you see this on the recruiting trail especially. It's like a kid that players tend to gravitate toward. And I noticed during the practices with Quade, we made a big deal about the Kentucky guys all living it up together and having fun, but he was like he was just that guy in the huddle that everybody sort of was looking at, and that's just the way it was. And there was a couple other players like that out there. The kid going to Alabama from Georgia, that point guard was like that. I can't think of his name right now. He was like that, but Quade just sort of had a special quality, very vocal, and that is going to be important because and maybe Wenyen or Sasha develops into this, we just don't know. But Wenyen, not exactly the most strong-headed vocal leadership type, and we'll have to see what Sasha does when he's kind of given a showcase to do it. But somebody's going to have to step forward, and I don't think Diallo, he's not exactly the most vocal either.
It doesn't seem like that to me.
So maybe
very limited interactions with
right.
him, so.
Well, I will say too, on the leadership point, I've thought about this maybe too much, but PJ Washington's dad is a coach. Kevin Knox's father and the Washingtons, they were very close, and then the father was very vocal and talked to a lot of the kids. So that plays into it a little bit for me. Always a coach's son. You look at that. So I think it's a group that's going to have a lot of high basketball IQ guys. I'm just not sure whenever they get into a close game, maybe early, we'll say Kansas early, who is it that's going to say, hey, here's what we need to do? Calipari talks about it all the time, how he wants to have a team that's sort of, empowered out on the court. I'm not sure. That's really hard to ask. I mean, I don't know if Isaiah Briscoe's leadership was always positive last year, but at least it was there. Like you knew there was going to be somebody that was going to have some edge to them. I don't know that going into this year they're going to have kind of the same personalities.
And it'll be interesting with Quade in particular because he gets that Ulis comparison so much, a lot because of their size and the way they play, and he's bigger than Ulis, even though he's going to be undersized for most Calipari point guards. But Tyler, for as demonstrative a leader and as an instant impact he made at Kentucky, still that freshman year, he did have the benefit of coming in off the bench on that second platoon and deferring to the Harrison twins and Willie Cauley-Stein and those older guys who were around. And then his sophomore year was able to come, arguably the best point guard in America and the best leader that Kentucky has had at that position since Calipari got here. I do not think it's fair to expect that of Green immediately because even Ulis had a learning adjustment and had some older guys to defer to. He's not going to have that on this team, like we've said so many times now. I'll be interested to see how he handles that pressure, especially the first loss or two or when it happens, that stretch they're inevitably going to hit where things aren't going well that all these freshmen have to face. If there's not an older guy for him to lean on, how is that going to affect his play on the court too? Right.
And as far as point guards go, I don't think that I've ever covered as cerebral or as intelligent a guy as De'Aaron Fox, at least savvy. Right. And I think that it's not a coincidence that he really turned it on, especially after he got healthy. But that Texas A&M game at the end of the season, through the SEC tournament, NCAA tournament, he was at a different level for some reason. And I think I really believe that it took him from November to like maybe February to feel like he could be in a position where it was like, okay, I can take the ball to the rim every time if I need to. I think it took him that long to develop that confidence. So I don't think you can understate kind of what you're getting at in terms of having somebody to help out with that.
And interestingly enough, for Fox, it even seemed like that switch kind of finally flipped on after Kentucky could prove that they could win without him.
Right, yeah.
Which I don't know that this team can win without Quade Green next year the way it's currently constructed. There's just not another obvious, because if it's not Green, it's going to be Alexander, who's going to have the exact same questions, if not more, as in terms of personality and the recruiting hype and all those sorts of situations. It's going to be really interesting. I mean, obviously, John Calipari has proven he can win with freshman point guards, John Wall, whoever else you want to look at, Brandon Knight. So Quade Green can do it. It's just all those other guys have had at least one or two veterans to lean on. And I think that's the real concern for this team as it's currently constructed. As we're talking about veterans and shooting all those things, we should probably point out that Cam Johnson, the graduate transfer from Pitt, is, as we're recording this, technically still available. I think he visited North Carolina recently, but there's no real reason at this point to expect that he's going to end up in Kentucky as far as we're aware, right?
Yeah, and I think that the media push against the transfer rules, once you start seeing that, I think it makes it pretty obvious where he wants to go.
Yes.
Where he's being restricted to go.
For background there, Pitt is limiting his ability to transfer to North Carolina because of being within the ACC, and they want him to have to sit out a year. We'll see how that all plays out. But at this point, especially with Knox and Diallo both on the roster, there's just not a real obvious fit for Cam Johnson here. So that's a veteran option for leadership and shooting that just it does not appear is going to be on Kentucky next year. So the roster as we know it right now, as far as we know, there's no reason to think it's going to be anywhere else. So it's going to have to come from these guys as far as we know. Yeah,
and one more thing. I think somebody like Gilgeous-Alexander, who started his career he's from Canada originally, moved to Tennessee just to further his basketball career, has played all over the place in international play or in AAU tournaments and whatnot. He's a well-traveled and a well-rounded individual. I saw him at the Derby Classic All-Star game. He's a guy that might not be as phased as some. I mean, these kids coming in today, you know, Calipari makes the statement all the time. They've traveled the world playing AAU ball now. So maybe we make too much about the inexperience factor, but I definitely think that, October, November is going to be a little bit different than it has been in previous seasons.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. We're talking about October and November right now. I think it's fair to expect by March all these guys are going to have developed a group to where they can win tournament games, because obviously Calipari teams never have a ton of guys who have been in the tournament situation to lean on before this team last year. Isaiah Briscoe was really the only guy to speak of, with Derek Willis a little bit and Dominique Hawkins a couple years ago, who had played a really big role in the tournament. So that's not as big a concern as how ugly it may get at times in that first semester and into the early parts of SEC play. Is this going to be a team that we think is going to start top 5 preseason, obviously? I would not be shocked to see them lose some games to where they drop down towards the 20 range at some point in this season and then work their way back up. It's just going to be really hard early to see how this team develops and if these inexperienced questions play out or not.
Exactly. This is going to put Calipari's claim that other team, if Kentucky doesn't know what they've got, then other teams don't know what they've got. So he started saying that last season. That's why they had so much success early in the schedule. Well, that'll put his claim to the test. We'll see.
That was an interesting new kind of development in his narrative about.
I think it was
youngest
partly
teams.
true.
Right, I think it was too. He said that because he always goes into a year time, and he's going to do it this year. He's already started. This is going to be the youngest team he's ever coached, whatever, and expect some bumps along the road. But then we've seen them beat teams like Kansas and Duke and whoever in those Champions Classic and the other early kind of marquee events they have, and then hit that lull at some point in December or January, whenever it comes. And Calipari's theory he suggested this season was that because nobody else knew them either, early they could play how they wanted to, but then after they got tape and after they got scouted, teams decided they were going to play them a different way and they had to adjust. We'll see if that's the case. I still think it's going to be really difficult early on against some of these marquee teams that they're going to play, regardless of how much or how little they know about Kentucky's roster.
I'll put Calipari, the truth meter, at about maybe 70 or 80% on that Calipari statement. That's pretty high.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, one of his more true statements that he's had. I expect to hear from Calipari at some point in the next couple weeks. He usually does a post-spring kind of wrap-up news conference, and we'll get to talk to some returning players at some point, either in June or July. So that's going to be coming down the pipe for basketball. So that we definitely by no means will be turning the page from basketball. It never stops in Kentucky, as I'm sure Fletcher has learned in his first few months on the job here. That being said, the other big story for Kentucky the athletic department this week is the baseball regional, which is coming back to Kentucky for the first time since 2006. We mentioned earlier they're going to face Ohio at noon on Friday in the first game, the 4 seed of the regional. NC State and Indiana, the other 2 teams, squaring off on Friday. Double elimination, 4-team regional. And then if they were to make it out of the regional, which they have never done since the tournament adopted this format, they've never made a super regional before, they most likely would be facing Louisville next week. So I think we're all talking about that already, obviously, because it makes it really attractive, especially for us at the Louisville Courier-Journal. I will be interested to see how Kentucky's team approaches that this weekend with the super regional, that marquee matchup looming over their heads, and whether or not they can stay focused on the task at hand on Friday.
Yeah, well, I got to give you credit, John, because you know your baseball, and you did predict that Kentucky might struggle a little bit in SEC play. I think you told me that. Yeah. I don't know if I was supposed to say that on the air, but you kind of saw that coming. I mean, you had some teams that were kind of playing for bids and playing for their life. But I think that in terms of draw, I know that it might sound unfair that Kentucky might have to go through Louisville. I mean, these are 2 teams that were very evenly matched in the regular season, and both were kind of vying for super regional bids or to host. But I'm pretty excited about it because I think it creates a nice matchup against a decent rival in Indiana early, and then you got a major matchup looming there with Louisville in the super regional. I think that'd be a lot of fun for fans, media types, all of us involved.
Yeah, I'm definitely would be interested to see that. I've always said, and I've written a ton about Kentucky baseball in my 7 or 8 years on this job now, probably more than anybody else in terms of. I used to run a website that was specifically devoted to college baseball in Kentucky. So since doing this professionally, I've always wanted to see Kentucky and Louisville square off in a traditional 3-game kind of weekend series, because they play these midweek games. And obviously fans from both schools kind of tune in for those 2 games every year, because the baseball following at either program is not super consistent in terms of a week-in, week-out basis. So they tune in for the rivalry game. And there's bragging rights on either side, but just in college baseball in general, those Tuesday, Wednesday games are not a very accurate representation of either team as a whole, because neither of them are going to throw one of their top 3 starting pitchers. It's probably going to be a freshman or a sophomore or even a bullpen day going out in the midweek game, so it's hard to gauge how much those mean. Kentucky did split the series this season against Louisville, dominated Indiana in the midweek game they played against them. But I don't expect those outcomes to have any sort of jurisdiction in the regional or in the super regional were they to get there. But I'll be interested to see how they matched up when you get your best product from both teams out on the field. I think that'd be a really fun thing to see for Kentucky and Louisville. We saw it a little bit a couple years ago in a regional when Kentucky played at Louisville, but even then, by the time they actually matched up, Kentucky's pitching staff was so decimated that it didn't work out. I think the one real question, and I was talking with a couple other writers yesterday at the pre or the post bracket show press conference Kentucky was having, the question I think for Nick Mingione, UK's coach, is how he sets up his pitching rotation this weekend. Obviously, Sean Jelly, the 6'11", their Friday night starter, normally the SEC pitcher of the year, which I think surprised some people last year, was awful. Well, maybe awful is not the word, but the results were awful. In his one start in the SEC tournament, gave up 10 runs. He struck out 10 guys in 5 innings, but gave up 10 runs. Maybe his worst start of the season. Do you throw him Friday against Ohio, the 4 seed in the regional, or do you hope to save him for the second day when they'd have to face NC State or Indiana, obviously better programs than Ohio, and maybe throw Zach Thompson, the freshman, or somebody else on Friday night? I'll be interested to see how Mingione approaches that this weekend.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, obviously last week at the SEC tournament, they played South Carolina in their opening game and then rolled right into a really good team in LSU. But do you see, is that troubling? Is there any maybe positive spinning out of that? I mean, I know you're on the road there. Now they're hosting. It's a totally different circumstance. But, what can they take from that? Or does it bother you that played out the way it did, losing to South Carolina?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely troubling. Not just last week, but the fact that they lost 2 or 3 at Florida in the last week of the season with the SEC championship on the line. Obviously, they swept Tennessee the week before that, but even losing 2 or 3 to Georgia, 3 weeks ago now at home, there's no question the momentum is headed the wrong way for this team. And Mingione yesterday said that he doesn't really believe in momentum, which is convenient because they don't have any of it right now. But if you're looking at why Kentucky did not get a national seed, that's it right there. I mean, they lost 4 of their last 5 games. Lost that series to Georgia 3 or 4 weeks ago now. whereas Stanford, the team that ended up number 8 in the last 8 seed, has won, I think, 21 of 23 games going into the tournament. And when you compare those two things and their resumes are basically identical, that's going to be the edge that the committee is going to give almost every time.
Right.
And in terms of the super regional fairness of it, Louisville has also struggled towards the end of the year, and they ended up dropping from, at times, one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the country all the way to 7 in the national seed rank. And if you assume Kentucky is the first or second best non-national seed, then the geography, the parity, and obviously the intrigue of that matchup made it almost impossible for the committee to pass up. So we'll see how that plays out. But in terms of the momentum, if I'm a Kentucky fan, I'm definitely concerned with the way things have gone last year. Not only because of the results not being good recently, but also, like the basketball team we mentioned, they don't have a ton of experience on this team in terms of postseason play. They've got a bunch of old guys, juniors and seniors, who played big roles for them, but only a couple who were even on the team the last time Kentucky was in the tournament.
I see it. Now, I've been watching Reds games for a while now, a couple of weeks at least. So, I know, like you just said, you're a big baseball guy, but from the outside looking in, and I've been around the team a few times, their lineup, it seems like, is national caliber. Like, they can compete to get to Omaha with their lineup. Do you think they have the pitching depth, though, to sort of survive? Like they're kind of having to make the decisions now, like you're talking about, withholding their number one starter for a couple of days. Do they have enough depth to maybe make those kinds of decisions?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. My guess, or the way I would lean right now, is no. I mean, if Kentucky doesn't make it to Omaha or doesn't make it out of even the regional this weekend, I think it's going to be a pitching issue for them. I will say it's interesting, 3 years ago now, when Kentucky was at Louisville in that regional, Gary Henderson, the coach at the time, decided to hold A.J. Reed, who was their ace, the national player of the year and a two-way player, but was a very good pitcher at the time, their Friday night starter. He held him for the second game, anticipating playing Louisville, because Kentucky was the 2 or the 3 and Louisville was the 1 in that region, playing them on Saturday, and pitched Kyle Cody, who was a first-round draft prospect kind of pitcher, but had never put it together on the mound for Kentucky in Game 1. And Cody went out there against Kansas and just imploded in the first inning. I think gave him 5 or 6 runs in the first inning, and they ended up losing to Kansas, so they didn't even play Louisville the next day, and that really backfired in terms of setting up their pitching. For this year's team, I would maybe lean towards pitching a guy like Thompson on Friday against Ohio and then holding Jelly for the second game. But beyond those two guys, Justin Lewis is obviously very good in starting pitcher, but Zach Logue, who's been their Saturday starter all season, has not been very good of late. Pitched out of the bullpen last week in Hoover, and it sounds like maybe pitching out of the bullpen this weekend. Mingione yesterday said you can't worry about the second game. You got to worry about winning Friday. Then you got to worry about winning Saturday. And he's not going to sit there and plan out this. We got to hold this guy to pitch in X scenario. So we'll see how that plays out. That's why it's really important for Kentucky to stay in the winners bracket in this situation, especially this weekend, because when you lose and you have to play that extra game to get through, the pitching depth becomes even more of a question mark. And in that scenario, I definitely don't see them making it out.
We definitely took this podcast in the inside baseball realm.
Yeah, and so hopefully none of you tuned out there and fell asleep. We will have lots of baseball coverage on the website, courier-journal.com, and in the print edition of the paper all week. The regional starts Friday, plays Saturday and Sunday, and Monday if there's a second championship game necessary. And then the super regional, obviously, the week after that. We will also blow out Louisville's regional in terms of our compatriots on the Louisville side of things, the Courier-Journal. But other than that, we'll have lots of basketball, lots of football, the normal coming up over the next couple of weeks in podcast form. Make sure you stay tuned for all that in the future. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm John Hale _CJ on Twitter. He's at Fletcher Page. Follow us both. Like the Cats HQ app on Facebook, all those kind of things. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks.